My daughter forged my signature and secretly sold my house for $800,000. She wanted to run away with the money, but the next day, I showed up at her doorstep with 2 police officers. When I asked her, "Good day, dear listeners. It's Louisa again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end, and let me know which city you're listening from. That way, I can see how far my story has traveled." My name is Margaret Elaine Corwin, and I am 71 years old. I want you to know that before I tell you the rest of this story, because I think it matters. 71 years old, and I still mow my own lawn. I still bake apple pie from scratch every Sunday. I still sleep in the same house on Sycamore Lane in Denton, Texas, where I raised 2 children, buried 1 husband, and planted 3 oak trees that are now taller than the roof. Or rather, I used to sleep there. That house is what this story is about. My husband, Gerald, passed 8 years ago from a heart attack. Quiet man, Gerald. Loved baseball, hated confrontation, made the best scrambled eggs I have ever tasted in my life. When he died, he left me the house outright, no mortgage, and a small life insurance policy that I mostly used to fix the roof and put new windows in. I was not a rich woman, but I was a stable one. That house was worth something in the neighborhood of $800,000 by the time everything happened. The neighborhood had grown, the market had climbed, and 30 years of careful maintenance had done the rest. It was my only real asset, my security. My plan for old age. I have 2 children. My son, Daniel, lives in Portland with his wife and 2 boys. He calls every Sunday. He is a steady, unremarkable man, and I mean that as the deepest compliment I know how to give. My daughter, Lisa Marie Corwin, now Lisa Hargrove after her second marriage, is a different story entirely. Lisa is 51 years old, and she has spent most of her adult life making choices that required other people to clean up after her. 2 divorces, a bankruptcy in 2014, a brief, bewildering period when she was convinced she could become a real estate investor, despite having no capital and no patience. She was charming when she needed something and cold when she didn't, and I had spent decades making excuses for her that I probably should not have made. She moved back to Denton in the spring of 2022 after her second marriage collapsed. Her ex-husband, Ray Hargrove, had apparently discovered certain financial irregularities in their joint accounts. I didn't ask for details, and Lisa didn't offer them. She arrived at my door with 2 suitcases and a man I had never met named Derek, who she described as her business partner. Derek was 43, tan in a way that seemed effortful, and had the particular smile of a person who has learned to perform warmth without feeling it. He wore a large silver watch and spoke often about opportunities. I did not like him from the first moment, but Lisa was my daughter, and my door was open. For the first few months, things were manageable. Lisa and Derek were staying at an apartment across town. She insisted on that at least, and I was relieved. She came by several times a week, sometimes to have dinner, sometimes to help with small things around the house. She started asking questions that seemed at first like normal conversation. How much did I think the house was worth now? Had I ever thought about downsizing? Did I have a will in place? Was the deed still in Gerald's name, or had I transferred it? I answered, honestly, the way you do with your own child. I told her the house was in my name alone, that the deed had been transferred after Gerald died, that yes, I had a will, and Daniel and she were equal beneficiaries. I noticed the questions, but I told myself it was normal. She was in financial trouble. Of course she was thinking about inheritance. Of course she was curious. I was her mother. What was I supposed to think? Then in September, small things began to disappear. A folder from my filing cabinet, the one where I kept property tax records, and the copy of the deed. I thought I had misplaced it. A bank statement from the Denton National account. A photocopy of my driver's license that I kept paper-clipped inside my passport. I searched the house twice. I chalked it up to age, to distraction, to the particular cruelty of getting older. The first real alarm came on a Tuesday morning in October, when I got a phone call from a woman named Karen Phelps at Lone Star Title and Escrow. She was calling, she said, to confirm some details related to a property transaction. I told her she had the wrong number. She said, "No, ma'am." She had Margaret Elaine Corwin of 447 Sycamore Lane. I said that was me, yes, but I had no idea what she was talking about. There was a pause on the line. The kind of pause that means the other person has just understood something terrible. She told me she would need to call me back. She never did, but I couldn't sleep that night. I lay in the dark in the house where I had lived for 30 years, and I listened to it breathe around me, and I asked myself, what exactly is happening to my home? And then 3 weeks later, I found out. A letter arrived from a law office in Dallas. It was addressed to me. It informed me that the sale of my property at 447 Sycamore Lane had been completed on October 14th for the sum of $800,000. The new owners were expected to take possession within 60 days. My signature was on the documents, except I had never signed anything. I sat down at my kitchen table and read the letter 4 times. My hands were not shaking. I want you to know that. My hands were completely still. But something inside me went very, very quiet. The kind of quiet that comes just before you decide to fight. I sat at that kitchen table for a long time. The letter was from a firm called Weston and Greer, and the attorney's name printed at the bottom was a Paul M. Greer. I read his phone number 3 times until I had it memorized. I looked at the date of the alleged sale, October 14th, and I counted backward through my memory of that day. I had been at my neighbor Patricia's house for her birthday lunch. I had come home around 3 in the afternoon. I had watched the evening news and gone to bed early because I had a cold coming on. I had not been anywhere near a title office or a notary or a law firm. I had not signed my name to anything. The thing about fear is that it has 2 versions. There is the fear that paralyzes, the kind that sits on your chest and tells you it is already over, that you are old and alone and the world has moved faster than you, that perhaps you misremember, perhaps you are confused, perhaps you have simply lost track of your own life. I felt that fear for perhaps 20 minutes. I let myself feel it, because pretending it wasn't there would not have helped. And then I folded it up and put it somewhere out of the way, because I had work to do. I thought about Lisa. I thought about the questions she had asked over the months. I thought about the folder that had disappeared, the bank statements, the photocopy of my driver's license. I thought about Derek and his silver watch and his talk of opportunities. I thought about Lisa's bankruptcy, her divorces, her long record of choosing shortcuts over effort. And I thought, of course this is what happened. The logic of it was awful in its simplicity, but I was careful not to let my conclusions outrun my evidence. I had lived long enough to know that being right without proof is the same as being wrong in a courtroom. The first thing I did was call Daniel. It was nearly 10 at night in Portland, but he answered on the second ring because Daniel is that kind of son. I read him the letter. There was silence. Then he said, "Mom, don't touch anything. Don't call Lisa. Don't call that law office tonight. Wait until tomorrow morning, and we're going to do this carefully." He booked a flight to Dallas for the following afternoon. The second thing I did, before I went to bed because I knew I wouldn't sleep and I needed to be useful, was go through the house systematically. I was looking for anything that remained, anything they might have missed. The original deed was gone from my filing cabinet, as I had noticed weeks ago. But I found, tucked inside, an old cookbook on the kitchen shelf. Purely by habit, because I had once hidden cash there during a bad stretch in the 80s. A photocopy of the deed from 2009, when I had refinanced and the title company had sent duplicates. It was not the current document, but it had my name on it. It existed. I put it in my coat pocket. In the morning, I called Patricia. Patricia Odom has been my neighbor for 22 years, and she is a retired paralegal who worked for a family law firm in Fort Worth for 3 decades. I had not planned to ask for her help, I didn't want to involve anyone unnecessarily. But I was standing in my kitchen thinking about what I didn't know, and what I didn't know was almost everything about how real estate fraud actually works. Patricia came over within 15 minutes, still in her housecoat, and I showed her the letter. She read it twice. She set it down carefully, the way you set down something fragile. She said, "Maggie, this is a forged deed. They would have needed to forge your signature on a grant deed, then get it notarized, then file it with the county recorder. That's at least 3 separate criminal acts." She paused. "And they would have needed your personal identification information to make it look right." I told her about the missing documents, about my driver's license photocopy. She nodded slowly. "Okay," she said. "Here is what you do." Patricia outlined it for me over coffee, and I wrote everything down. Step 1. Contact Denton County Clerk's office and request a certified copy of whatever deed was on file for my property. Because if a fraudulent deed had been recorded, it would be there. Step 2. Do not contact the buyers or the law firm yet, because I needed to know what I was dealing with before I tipped anyone off. Step 3. Find an attorney who handled real estate fraud. Step 4. File a police report, but only after I had the certified deed copy in hand, because the police would need documentation. "And Lisa?" I asked. Patricia looked at me with the particular expression of a woman who has spent 30 years watching families destroy each other in courtrooms. "Not yet," she said quietly. "Let her think you don't know. That was the hardest part." My daughter was presumably sitting somewhere across town, possibly spending money that had come from the sale of my home, and I was supposed to drink my coffee and act as if nothing had happened. But Patricia was right. The moment Lisa knew I had received that letter, the evidence trail would start moving. Money would disappear. Documents would be destroyed. Derek would evaporate. Daniel arrived that evening. He drove straight from the airport to Sycamore Lane, and we sat at the kitchen table, the same table where I had read the letter the night before, and we made a plan. He had already, on the plane, looked up real estate fraud attorneys in the Dallas-Fort Worth area and identified 3. He had written their names and numbers on a folded piece of paper, which he placed on the table between us like a small flag planted in difficult ground. "We're going to get your house back, Mom," he said. I looked at him. He looked like Gerald, a little, around the eyes. I said, "I know we are. But first, I need to know exactly what they did." That night, before Daniel and I turned off the lights, I drove past Lisa's apartment. Not to stop. Not to confront her. Just to look at the lit windows and remind myself that the woman inside was someone I had held as a baby. Someone I had driven to school and nursed through fevers and forgiven more times than I could count. And to understand, fully, that none of that changed what needed to happen next. The next morning, Daniel drove me to the Denton County Clerk's office on McKinney Street. It was a Wednesday, gray and cold the way North Texas gets in November. Not the dramatic cold of real winters, but a sullen, low-sky cold that makes everything feel slightly less forgiving. We arrived when they opened at 8. The woman at the counter was young and efficient, and clearly not accustomed to people coming in with the particular tight-jawed composure that Daniel and I were wearing. I gave her my name and the property address, and asked for a certified copy of the current deed on file. She disappeared into the back for about 10 minutes. When she returned, she was carrying a document in a manila folder, and she had the careful expression of someone who knows they are handling something that is about to become someone's problem. She slid it across the counter without a word. I opened the folder. There it was. A grant deed dated October 11th, conveying the property at 447 Sycamore Lane from Margaret Elaine Corwin to a buyer named Thomas A. Whitfield. The signature on the grantor line read, Margaret E. Corwin, in a looping, confident hand. It was not my handwriting. I have small, angular letters that Gerald used to say looked like a nurse's shorthand. This signature was rounded and decorative. Closer, actually, to Lisa's handwriting than to mine. Below the signature was a notary stamp. The notary's name was C. Delaney. Commission number, date, seal. All present, all looking legitimate. I stood at that counter for a long moment. Daniel put his hand on my shoulder. I asked the clerk if she could tell me when the deed had been recorded. She checked her system. October 15th, she said. One day after the sale date in the letter from Weston and Greer. I asked for 2 certified copies. I paid for them. I put them in my bag. Outside in the parking lot, Daniel said, "Mom, just that." I knew what he meant. "I know," I said. We went directly from the county clerk's office to the office of an attorney named Robert Finch, whom Daniel had identified the previous evening as one of the 3 specialists in real estate fraud in the area. His office was in a 2-story brick building on University Drive in Denton, and his assistant got us in to see him that same morning because Daniel had called ahead from the parking lot of the clerk's office and used the phrase, "forged deed, recorded fraud, please." Robert Finch was 60-something, gray-haired, unhurried in the way of a man who has seen most things that human beings do to each other over property. He read the letter from Weston and Greer. He read the certified deed copy. He asked me 4 or 5 precise, unemotional questions. Had I signed any power of attorney in the last 2 years? No. Had I given anyone access to my personal documents? No, though I explained what had gone missing. Did I have any record of my whereabouts on October 11th, the date the deed was supposedly signed? I thought. That was a Saturday. I had been at a church rummage sale in the morning. Patricia had been with me. We had come home together around noon. Patricia could confirm that. Finch nodded slowly. He said, "Mrs. Corwin, what you have here is a fraudulently executed and recorded deed. Someone forged your signature, had it notarized, either with a corrupt notary or one who was deceived, and filed it with the county. This is felony real estate fraud in the state of Texas. It is also wire fraud if any of the transaction occurred electronically, which it almost certainly did, which makes it a federal crime." He paused. "Do you have a suspect?" I told him about Lisa, about Derek, about the missing documents. I told him about Lisa's financial history, her bankruptcy, Derek's presence, the months of questions about the property. He listened without expression. When I finished, he said, "I want you to go to the Denton Police Department today and file a report. Bring the certified deed copy, the letter from the law firm, and any documentation of the missing personal documents. Do not, under any circumstances, contact your daughter or her associate before the report is filed." I nodded. "And Mrs. Corwin," he said, looking at me steadily, "I need you to understand that this process will not be fast. It will not be painless, and it will almost certainly result in criminal charges against someone you love." "I understand," I said. "Do you?" he asked, not unkindly, but directly, the way a surgeon might ask before beginning. "She sold my house," I said. "The house where I raised her, I understand perfectly." We filed the police report that afternoon. The officer who took it, a detective Monica Garza, compact and focused, read everything with the attention it deserved. She told us that the county notary records would be subpoenaed, that the title company would be contacted, that the buyer's transaction records would be examined. She told us the investigation would take time. She told us not to discuss the case with any potential suspects. I drove home to Sycamore Lane that evening and sat in the driveway for a moment, looking at the house. Someone had recorded a document claiming it belonged to a stranger. And somewhere on the other side of Denton, I was fairly certain, Lisa had heard or sensed or intuited that something was shifting. Because that evening, for the first time in 3 weeks, she called me. I let it go to voicemail. Her voice was warm and easy, asking if I wanted to have lunch on Friday, saying she missed me, saying Derek had been asking about me. Perfectly normal. perfectly ordinary, which told me everything. Lisa never called without a reason. Robert Finch moved quickly once the police report was filed. Within the first week, he filed a civil complaint to void the fraudulent deed, which was a necessary legal step to protect the property from the buyer, a man named Thomas Whitfield, who, as far as the evidence suggested, was either an innocent purchaser deceived by false documents or a participant in the scheme. Finch's preliminary assessment was that Whitfield appeared to be a genuine buyer who had transacted in good faith through what he believed to be a legitimate sale. That complicated things legally, but did not change the fundamental fact. The deed was void because my signature was forged. Finch also retained a forensic document examiner named Dr. Sandra Holt, based in Fort Worth, who received the certified deed copy and a sample of my genuine handwriting and began her analysis. The county had subpoenaed the notary records for C. Delaney. Detective Garza's team had subpoenaed transaction records from Lone Star Title and Escrow. I went about my days as normally as I could manage. I answered Lisa's voicemail 2 days after she left it and told her Friday lunch didn't work, but maybe the following week. She sounded relieved, relaxed even. And I noted the relief, because relief meant she had been waiting to see if I would respond at all. Then, on a Thursday evening in mid-November, there was a knock at my front door. It was Lisa and Derek. Together. Lisa was holding a bottle of red wine. Derek was smiling the smile. I opened the door and looked at them and thought, someone told them something. Either they had checked in with Lone Star Title or Paul Greer at Weston, and Greer had flagged an inquiry, or, most likely, Lisa had a contact somewhere in the process who had let her know that questions were being asked. She was not a careful criminal, but she was not a stupid one. I invited them in. I set out glasses. I did not drink. Lisa was warm, chatty, touching my arm every few minutes. Derek said he had been reading about the real estate market in Denton and thought there were real opportunities for someone in my position, meaning a homeowner sitting on a valuable asset, meaning me. He talked about reverse mortgages, about senior living communities that were really quite wonderful, actually, about the peace of mind that came from liquidating before the market shifted. I watched them. I asked questions. I let them talk. It was Derek who finally dropped the warmth. He did it carefully, a shift in tone so precise it was almost elegant. He said that he had heard through industry contacts that someone had been making inquiries at the county clerk's office regarding my property. He said he hoped I hadn't been speaking to anyone who might give me the wrong impression about things. He said, and here he looked at me directly for the first time all evening, that some processes, once started, were very difficult to stop, and that the people caught in the middle of them sometimes suffered collateral damage that nobody wanted. It was a threat, a clean, professionally delivered threat. Lisa was looking at the table. I set down my glass. I said, Derek, are you telling me something about my home? He smiled again. I'm saying I'd hate to see you go through unnecessary stress, Margaret. You're 71 years old. You've been through a lot. Some things are better resolved quietly between family. I looked at Lisa. She looked up, and for just a moment the performance dropped and I saw it. Not guilt exactly, but the particular expression of a person who knows the hole they're in and has decided that digging faster is the only option. I said, I think you both should go home now. Derek started to say something else. I stood up. I am not a tall woman, but I have been a mother for 50 years, and I know how to occupy a room. I said, I would like you both to leave my house. They left. But at the door, Derek turned. Think carefully, Margaret, he said. You really don't want this to become complicated. I closed the door. I stood in my hallway for a moment. My heart was going faster than I would have liked. But underneath the fear, because I am honest enough to call it fear, was something steadier. They had come here because they were worried. People who are confident don't threaten. People who threaten are afraid of what you know. I called Daniel. I called Finch. I documented the visit in writing that same night, time, names, approximate quotes, and emailed it to Finch's office. And then I took 4 days. Not to hide or retreat, but to breathe. I drove to my sister Ruth's house in Waco. I sat on her porch and drank coffee and watched her cats move through the yard and did not talk about Lisa unless I wanted to. I went to bed early. I let Daniel handle the phone calls to Finch. I let myself be for 4 days, just a woman on a porch in November, gathering herself. It is not weakness to rest before the hardest part. It is arithmetic. When I returned from Waco, I found 2 things waiting for me. A voicemail from Lisa, softer this time, almost plaintive, saying she wanted to explain that things had gotten out of hand, that she had made mistakes she regretted, and that if I would just sit down with her privately, without lawyers or police involved, she was sure we could work something out. The second was a letter, hand-delivered and left in my mailbox without postage, no return address, typed on plain paper. It said, "Mrs. Corwin, dropping this matter would be in everyone's best interest, including yours. The buyers are ready to proceed. Fighting this will cost you more than the house is worth." No signature. I sat with both of them at my kitchen table. I read the letter twice. I played Lisa's voicemail once more, and I felt something that I can only describe as clarity. The particular stillness that comes when you have already decided, deeply and irrevocably, and the other side's attempts to move you only confirm that you made the right choice. I was not tempted. I want to be clear about that. There are people who, in my position, might have been, who might have looked at the cost of a legal fight, the newspapers, the family ruin of it, the prospect of watching a child go to prison, and decided that a quiet settlement, some portion of that money returned, some arrangement made, was the merciful or practical solution. I understood that calculus. I did not accept it, because a settlement would have meant accepting that what Lisa did was a transaction rather than a crime. And it was a crime. It was a crime against me, yes, but it was also a crime against the notary system, against the county records, against the buyer who had acted in good faith, against any future person who looked up that property and believed what they read. You do not make peace with fraud because the fraud is inconvenient to prosecute. I called Detective Garza's office and reported the unsigned letter. She sent someone to collect it for evidence. I called Robert Finch and told him about Lisa's voicemail. He noted it. He told me that the forensic document examiner had completed her preliminary report and that it was, in his words, definitive. He could not share details yet, but he told me to be patient. What I needed and what I went looking for was not legal or practical. It was human. Patricia already knew most of it, but I sat with her on her back porch that Saturday afternoon and told her everything. The visit from Lisa and Derek, the letter, the 4 days in Waco, the voicemail. Patricia listened the way only someone with 30 years of family law does. Without exclamation, without interruption. Only the occasional quiet nod that means I have seen this. I know what this is. When I finished, she poured more coffee and said, "You know what the hardest part is going to be, Maggie? It won't be the courtroom. It'll be the day she looks at you from the defendant's table and you have to hold steady." I thought about that. "I know," I said. "Can you?" she asked. I looked out at her yard. She had a bird bath that her husband had built 20 years ago, before he passed. The birds used it regardless. She stopped being my daughter the day she decided I was a transaction, I said. Patricia nodded slowly. "Then you'll be fine." I also called my pastor, Reverend James at Calvary Methodist, who had known me for 15 years. I didn't go looking for comfort or validation. I went looking for someone who would tell me honestly if they thought I was wrong. If pursuing this all the way was the right thing or only the satisfying thing. Reverend James listened for a long time and then said that mercy did not require enabling and that accountability was not the same as vengeance. He said this without drama, as a matter of simple fact, and it was exactly what I needed to hear. My neighbor on the other side, Howard Pruitt, a retired contractor, widower, quiet man who had shoveled my walk without being asked every winter for 12 years, knocked on my door one evening with a pot of chili he had made too much of. He didn't know the details of what was happening. He just said I looked like I could use a meal. I ate that chili, and I thought about the network of decent people that had built up around my life. Quietly, over decades. Patricia with her coffee and her clarity. Daniel calling every morning. Ruth's porch in Waco. Howard's chili. Reverend James's unembarrassed practicality. These were not dramatic rescues. They were the ordinary structure of a life lived with integrity, which generates, in times of need, a kind of low and reliable warmth. Lisa had Derek, and Derek, I was increasingly certain, would disappear the moment the legal structure became unavoidable. Across town, I imagined, they were watching and waiting, trying to read my silence, to calculate whether the threat had worked, whether the voicemail had found its mark. I gave them nothing to read. I went about my days. I attended church. I had coffee with Patricia. I called Daniel. I waited. Sometimes patience is the sharpest weapon available to you. It was a Sunday afternoon when they came again. Lisa alone this time. No Derek, which I noted immediately. She arrived with flowers, grocery store tulips in yellow and purple, and an expression of rehearsed vulnerability that I recognized from 30 years of watching her navigate consequences. She had been a gifted child at looking sorry. It had worked on me more times than I care to count. I let her in. I set the tulips on the counter without putting them in water. I sat down at the kitchen table and indicated the chair across from me. And she sat, and we looked at each other. She started slowly. She said she was sorry. She said she had panicked, that she had been in serious debt. And here she named a number that was genuinely alarming, though I knew Derek's fingerprints were on it. That Derek had told her it could all be handled quietly, a quick transaction, money wired, title transferred, and that by the time I found out she would be able to put the money back or make other arrangements. As if $800,000 was a sum one simply arranged to replace. She said she hadn't thought about how it would affect me. She said Derek had handled the specifics, meaning she was beginning already to build the architecture of her defense. I didn't know exactly how it was done. I trusted someone else. I was desperate. I listened to all of it. I did not interrupt. Then she shifted. The sorrow became something else. Not quite hardness, but the cousin of it. She said that the legal process was going to be very public and very painful. She said that Daniel's kids, my grandsons in Portland, were going to grow up knowing that their grandmother had sent their aunt to prison. She said that whatever money I recovered would be consumed by legal fees, and that I was 71 years old. And did I really want to spend however many years I had left fighting in courtrooms over a house? She said, "Mom, I am asking you to let this go, for our family, for us." I looked at her. I thought of the telephone in her hand when she had called to ask about the deed. I thought of my driver's license photocopy, gone from its paperclip. I thought of the letter in my mailbox with no signature. I thought of Derek's face at my door and his careful, professional threat, and I thought, she is not here to reconcile. She is here because the lawyers and the police have made her afraid and fear has sent her back to the one tool that has always worked on me: my love for her, my inability, historically, to hold a line when she cried. I said, "Lisa, I would like to ask you something." She waited. "The day you decided to do this, did you think about me at all? Not about getting caught. Not about logistics. About me. About what it would mean to me in this house on an ordinary morning to find out my daughter had stolen the only thing I had left." The rehearsed sorrow flickered. Underneath it was something raw and defensive. She said, "I knew you'd be upset, but—" "Upset?" I said. I let the word sit there. Something changed in her face. The performance fell away entirely, and what replaced it was the thing I had suspected was underneath. Not remorse, but frustration. The frustration of a person whose plan had not worked and who could not understand why the obstacles in front of her were not moving. She said, her voice changing register entirely, "Do you have any idea what this is going to cost you? Finch's fees alone." "Are mine to pay," I said. "You're going to destroy this family," she said, "over a house." "You destroyed this family," I said quietly, "over money." She stood up. The tulips were still on the counter without water, already beginning to close. She said something else then, not loudly, but with a precision that made it something other than emotion. She said that I should think about the fact that I was an old woman living alone and that being in a legal fight with the wrong people was not a safe position to be in. It was not quite a threat. It was something worse than a threat. It was the suggestion of one, wrapped in the language of concern. I stood up. I said, "Please leave my house." She left. But as I stood in my hallway afterward, listening to her car pull out of the driveway, I felt the fear return, not the manageable, productive kind, but the cold, aversive kind that makes the walls of a house feel thinner than they are. I was a 71-year-old woman, alone on Sycamore Lane, in a legal fight with people who had already forged a government document and threatened me twice. But here is what I have learned in 71 years. Fear is information. It tells you where the pressure is, which means it tells you where the strength needs to go. I stood in that hallway and let myself feel every bit of it, and then I used it. I called Robert Finch on a Sunday evening and told him exactly what Lisa had said, including the last part. I told him I wanted to move faster. "We're ready," he said. "As a matter of fact, I was going to call you in the morning. Dr. Holt's final report is in." Dr. Sandra Holt's final forensic report was 14 pages long. Robert Finch walked me through it on a Monday morning in his office while Daniel listened by phone. The conclusion was unambiguous. The signature on the grant deed of October 11th was not mine. Dr. Holt's analysis covered letter formation, pen pressure, signature line angle, and the specific characteristics of the M in Margaret and the C in Corwin that are consistent across 40 years of my documented signatures. The fraudulent signature had been produced by someone who had studied a sample, probably the photocopy of my driver's license, and reproduced it carefully, but not carefully enough. Additionally, the notary, C. Delaney, had been located by Detective Garza's team. His name was Christopher Delaney, and he was not a functioning notary in Texas. His commission had expired in 2019. The stamp used on the document was a reproduction of his former stamp. He was already cooperating with investigators and had identified the person who had approached him and paid him to stamp the document as someone matching Derek's description for a payment of $2,000 in cash. The title company, Lone Star Title and Escrow, had produced their transaction records. The purchase funds, $800,000, had been wired to an escrow account and then, upon the fraudulent closing, disbursed to an account in the name of MHC Investments, LLC. That LLC, Finch told me, had been registered in Nevada 3 months prior to the sale, its registered agent being one Derek Allen Monroe. Lisa's name did not appear on the LLC, but her phone number appeared in the transaction communications, and she had signed as a transaction coordinator on an internal Lone Star document, a role that had given her access to the process without appearing on the primary records. It was, Finch said, the work of people who were careful but not expert. Detective Garza had, by this point, obtained arrest warrants. The morning of the arrests was a Tuesday in early December. I did not go. I had been asked if I wanted to be present for any of it, and I had thought about it and decided that this was not something I needed to witness. What I needed was for it to happen correctly. I sat in my kitchen on Sycamore Lane and drank coffee and waited for Daniel to call. He called at 9:47 in the morning. "It's done, Mom," he said. "Both of them." Derek was arrested at the apartment he shared with Lisa. Lisa was arrested separately at a coffee shop where she had been meeting with someone, possibly an attorney of her own, Finch speculated, because she had reportedly seemed unsurprised, which was either preparation or shock, presenting as composure. Both were charged with deed fraud, forgery of a public document, identity theft, and conspiracy. The federal wire fraud charges were referred to the U.S. Attorney's Office in Dallas. But the decisive scene, the one that the story in my head had been building toward, came 3 days later at a preliminary hearing at the Denton County Courthouse. I was there for that. Robert Finch sat to my left. Daniel sat to my right. Lisa and Derek were at the defendant's table with their respective attorneys. It was the first time I had seen Derek in a courtroom without his silver watch, in a plain dark jacket, and the performance of warmth was entirely gone. What remained was a man who looked like what he was, a person who had made a calculation and gotten it wrong. Lisa looked at me once, across the courtroom. I want to describe that look accurately because it matters. It was not the look I had feared. It was not an appeal, not the return of the rehearsed sorrow that had worked on me for decades. It was something stripped of everything unnecessary, and what was left was, I think, recognition. She knew I had held steady. She knew the house of cards that she and Derek had built was coming down, and that I had been the one to pull the first card. I held her gaze. I did not look away. I did not perform coldness or satisfaction or grief. I simply looked at her, the way you look at something you have fully understood. Her attorney spoke. Derek's attorney spoke. Finch spoke. The judge, a small, precise woman named the Honorable Patricia Adler, asked sharp questions and received answers that established clearly and publicly what had been done. At one point, Derek's attorney attempted to suggest that certain documents had been signed under a power of attorney arrangement, implying my knowledge or consent. The judge looked at him over her glasses and said that she had reviewed the forensic report and the affidavit and the subpoenaed communications and would appreciate counsel not wasting her time. Derek, for the first time since I had known him, had nothing to say. Lisa's attorney requested bond. The judge set it at $100,000. Derek's attorney requested bond. Given his role in the LLC, the wired funds, and the out-of-state corporate structure, the judge denied it pending further review. When we walked out of the courthouse into the cold December afternoon, Daniel took my arm and said nothing for a moment. The sky was that particular pale winter blue that Texas gets, enormous and indifferent. "How do you feel?" he asked finally. I thought about it. "Like it's almost over," I said. The legal process that followed was not fast, but it was thorough. Derek Monroe was held without bail and remained in custody through the duration of the trial proceedings. His Nevada LLC was dissolved by court order. The full $800,000 that had been disbursed to MHC Investments LLC had been partially spent. on an apartment in Austin, on a car, on what investigators described as various business expenses. But over $600,000 remained in the account and was frozen immediately upon the warrant. The remainder was assessed against Derek's personal assets. Thomas Whitfield, the good faith buyer, had his purchase voided by the court and his funds returned from the escrow account that had been frozen early in the investigation. He was, from all I was told, a reasonable man who had been deceived and who bore the situation with understandable frustration, but no malice toward me. The fraudulent deed was vacated. My name was restored on the county records as the sole owner of 447 Sycamore Lane. I stood in Robert Finch's office on a Wednesday afternoon in February, and he handed me the certified copy of the corrected deed, and I held it in both hands for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. Lisa's case moved on a separate track from Derek's. Her attorney negotiated, as attorneys in these cases do. Lisa had not technically touched the forged deed directly. She had operated as the coordinator, the arranger, the person who had stolen my documents and provided the access and the opportunity without putting her name on the instrument of forgery. This distinction mattered legally, though it did not matter morally, and Robert Finch and Detective Garza made certain it did not matter practically. Lisa pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit real estate fraud, identity theft in the second degree, and filing a false instrument with a government body. She did not go to trial. Her sentencing took place in late March, on a gray morning, in a courtroom I attended with Daniel and Patricia. She received 3 years probation, 200 hours of community service, and a restitution order that required her to repay a portion of the legal and investigative costs. She was barred from engaging in any real estate transaction in the state of Texas for a period of 10 years. She would carry this on her record permanently. I had been asked before sentencing whether I wished to submit a victim impact statement. I said yes. I wrote it myself, without help from Daniel or Finch, at the kitchen table on Sycamore Lane. I did not write it to be cruel. I did not write it to obtain a specific outcome. I wrote it because I had something true to say, and a judge in a position of authority was going to read it, and I believed that truth, stated clearly and without drama, was the most effective thing I could put in that room. I said that my home was not merely a financial asset. I said that it was the place where my children had been raised, and where my husband had died, and where I had spent decades building a life. I said that the crime that had been committed was not only against me personally, but against the systems of record and trust that allow ordinary people to own things, to be believed when they say this is mine. I said that I had not pursued this case out of anger, but out of the conviction that the alternative, accepting theft because the thief was my daughter, would have been a lie, and I did not intend to end my life having accepted a lie of that magnitude. The judge read it. She noted it on the record. Derek Monroe went to trial and was convicted on all counts, including the federal wire fraud charge. He was sentenced to 6 years in federal prison. The silver watch was not in evidence, but I thought about it during the sentencing hearing. Every piece of performed confidence, every smile, every careful threat, all of it had resolved into this: a man in a plain dark jacket receiving a number from a judge who had no interest in his performance whatsoever. After the sentencing, Robert Finch shook my hand and told me I had been his most composed client in 30 years. I thanked him and wrote his final check. In the parking lot outside the courthouse, Daniel and I stood in the weak spring sunshine. He said something about going to celebrate, dinner, wherever I wanted. I thought about it. Home, I said. I'd like to go home. Spring came to Sycamore Lane the way it always does, slowly, and then all at once. The oak trees putting out their pale new leaves. Patricia's azaleas going pink along the fence. The air softening by mid-April into something almost gentle. I planted tomatoes in the side bed for the first time in several years. I had been putting it off for no particular reason, and then one morning, I simply stopped putting it off. There is something about pressing seeds into ground that you know belongs to you, truly belongs to you, your name on the deed, no question, no shadow. That is different from any other gardening I have done. I just pressed the seeds in and went inside and made coffee. I want to tell you about my life now in the year that followed, because I think it matters just as much as everything that came before. I did not spend the year in triumph. I did not walk around my house with a sense of victory that buzzed in my chest. What I felt, mostly, was settled. A word that sounds passive but is, I have decided, the best kind of feeling available to a person. Settled meaning, I am where I am supposed to be. I know what I did. I know it was right. I can put it down now. There is a real difference between winning and simply being restored to what was always yours, and I think that difference is important to name. I was not elevated by what happened. I was returned, and being returned, after everything, felt like more than enough. Daniel brought my grandsons, Marcus and Eli, to visit that summer. They are 11 and 8. And they climbed the oak trees in the front yard and ate tomatoes directly off the vine and spent an entire afternoon trying to catch a lizard that lived under the back steps. Marcus, the older one, asked me once if I had ever done something really hard. I thought about it and said yes. He asked what it was. I said I had had to tell the truth about something when it would have been easier to stay quiet. He considered this with the grave seriousness that 11-year-olds sometimes produce unexpectedly, and then said, "Did you get in trouble?" I said no. He said good, and went back to the lizard. I stood on the back porch and watched him crouch in the grass, patient as only children can be. And I thought, this is what it was all for. Not the deed, not the courtroom. This boy and his brother in my yard in the summer, with the ordinary permission to just be here. Patricia and I began walking every morning at 7, a habit we had talked about for years and never done. 3 miles, down toward the park and back, while the neighborhood was still quiet. We talked about everything and nothing. Her grandchildren, my tomatoes, old cases she half remembered from Fort Worth, Gerald, her husband, what we were reading, what we were thinking about. It was the kind of friendship that deepens when it is given time and regularity, and I was grateful to have arrived at an age where I understood that. Some mornings, we didn't talk much at all. We just walked. The light came through the trees at an angle that made even the parking lot look like something worth seeing. I had walked past that park for 20 years without really looking at it. I looked at it now. Howard next door finished restoring an old Ford pickup he had been working on for 2 years, and the sound of it running for the first time was loud enough that we both came out of our houses and stood in the driveways, laughing. He drove me around the block in it, windows down, in October, and the leaves were turning and the engine was loud, and I felt, for those 4 minutes, genuinely young. Small things. Real things. The kind that don't make the news and don't require a courtroom, but constitute, in their accumulation, an actual life. Reverend James asked me to speak to a women's group at the church about the experience. Not the legal mechanics, but the emotional navigation of it. I decided I would, because I had come to believe that the most useful thing you can do with a hard experience is let it become useful to someone else. Afterward, 3 women came to find me individually and told me versions of their own stories. The particular loneliness of being disbelieved or of believing, for too long, that love required silence. I drove home from that evening, feeling that I had used the experience correctly. Now let me tell you about Lisa, she is living in a one-bedroom apartment in Fort Worth, working as a data entry clerk for an insurance company, work she had described in another life as beneath her. She is fulfilling her community service hours at a food bank on weekends. The court-ordered restitution comes out of her paycheck in increments that will take years to complete. I did not arrange that outcome. The law arranged it. I only declined to prevent it. We have not spoken. She sent me a letter 4 months after the sentencing that I read once and then put in a drawer. It was not an apology, exactly. Part explanation, part grievance, part appeal. The word sorry appeared twice, in context that made it clear she was sorrier about the outcome than the act. I felt sad when I read it, in the way you feel sad about something that is entirely what it was always going to be. I did not respond. Whether she becomes the person who could receive what I might say is not in my hands, that is hard to accept, and then it isn't. Derek Monroe is in federal prison. His appeal was denied in January. The Austin apartment was sold to cover restitution costs. I think about him occasionally, not with satisfaction, not with anger, but with the flat curiosity you feel about a person who was, in the end, exactly what they appeared to be from the first moment. There is nothing complicated about Derek Monroe. There never was. I do not celebrate either of these outcomes. I note them because they are the truth, and the truth has a shape that matters even when it is uncomfortable. They made choices. The choices had consequences. This is not a story about cruelty or comeuppance. It is a story about what happens when things are allowed to be real. My house is worth, at current estimates, closer to $900,000 than $8. I have no intention of selling it. I have updated my will, reviewed it with a proper estate attorney, and put certain legal structures in place that would make a repetition of what happened considerably more difficult. I am not naive enough to think that legal structures prevent everything, but I am practical enough to know they change the calculation. I sleep in the same bedroom I have slept in for 30 years. I can see the largest oak tree from the window. Gerald planted it the year Daniel was born. It is enormous now and entirely indifferent to everything that has happened, which I find, most mornings, to be a considerable comfort. I look at it every morning when the light is coming up, before I get up for coffee, before Patricia knocks at 7, before the day asks anything of me at all. It doesn't look back. And that is exactly right. Now I want to ask you something honestly. What would you have done? If it had been your child, your home, your name on that forged deed, would you have held the line? Or would the weight of it have been too much? Tell me in the comments. I read every one. And if this story meant something to you, please subscribe, because there are more stories like this one, and every one of them is true. Thank you for listening all the way to the end. That means more than you know.